Apolitical Solution.
By James P. Pearce. We need to find a political solution until there is no political solution. This is usually the echo of both the left and the right in today's modern American landscape. Does policy legislate morality?
No.
Does policy affect change in local communities? Depends on who you ask. Does morality justify the policy?
It could.
Does the policy justify people to act morally? No. Does the justification of policy make it so it becomes law? Not all the time. Is politics downstream from culture? Yes. From there, this is a good roadmap as to why there is a mixed bag of a political spectrum and why the Overton window is growing ever more irrelevant. It has only stayed relevant for a sense of identity, yet we all know how identity politics go. So let us address the first rebuttal. The policy does not legislate morality. Of course, as human beings, we are essentially in wanting of the good. Yet what do we say about a barbaric society? One could argue that today's society is worse than we were off before. Evola pointed out how kings and the divine providence led to morality within the culture or state they were in the kingship of. However, there have been many bad kings, even those who have had the nerve to call themselves great. Does that morality then stem from a policy passed by a legislative body or by a king willing to do the bidding of a god or God himself? Is that not where that divine providence would derive itself from, good or bad? The answer to those two questions would be that divine providence should work throughout various good and bad events within someone's life. However, this is not always the case. It is not always the case, because not everyone believes, or I should say chooses not to believe in the divine, which is a scary proposition.
I do not even have to go that far back in history to find atheism as a mainstay in government, especially when legislated by a totalitarian strongman like Joseph Stalin.
So with that continuation, if the state does not believe in God, then what good is that legislated morality? Without God and without His grace, the story of Israel, the spiritual one, will always be our struggle with God. Let us look at the second rebuttal, the locality of policies. It is an anecdotal answer at best. I believe most people in any political realm can be rational about most circumstances. However, the denial of some flat-out truths on both sides is always going to lead to more of a circus act. Spigot pointing is a good answer to this question and one that has addressed this question at numerous levels of both the local, state, and federal levels of the government. In order to sway those anecdotes, people have to deal with the hard facts as to where the funding is rather than political grandstanding. This is why morality is always going to be ham-fisted at best and self-destructive at its worst. There are always going to be exceptions to these rules, and having effective local politics will help offset the way of the nation, usually. Let us look at the third rebuttal. Does morality justify the policies of a given legislature or the law of the land? It could. It is open-ended. As pointed out previously, self-destruction is not always on someone as a human being, but it could be a governing body, like a state or a church. Hardline evangelicals all the way to Hindu gurus could call on to heal the land or the law of it. The fact is that going to come from them or from God? This is where it gets open-ended, because I addressed both a Christian and a Hindu in my previous sentence. Grace may manifest its way through differently in both instances. To us, we do not know God's will, so therefore it is not up to me for that determination. The fact of the matter for the open-ended rebuke is the simple fact that lawmakers are going to take advantage of it.
Paying taxes to a state that has leached off of people who produce, yet they gallivant their moral causes to the public, well, you can see how this is open-ended.
The fact that it stays that way is somewhere in the middle, and that morality will always be the monkey, either dancing to the collection plate of that local evangelical, oftentimes a false one, or to another religion outside of the true God's faith. Both of those people could run for local, state or federal offices, and most of the time, people like the evangelical would win in more conservative states, and in today's political climate, the Hindu probably would win too. The fourth rebuttal is simple under commandments from God, but the takeaway is that not every government believes in God. You could even argue that most of the West does not anymore. Does that given policy justify people to act morally? Well, the usual response would be, the law was meant to be broken, then why have such a disgust for those moral lawmakers? This is the offset. This is why people reject the laws of false men. This is why people have to replace their religious beliefs with that of a secular state. This is why it gets empty-handed for those involved in politics. The well eventually runs dry on the virtue signaling. The fifth rebuttal will create some animosity, as I previously stated, towards lawmakers, as was addressed above. Does the justification of that policy make it so it becomes law? Talk about virtue signaling of false men on steroids, or an amped-up version of someone like Bernie Sanders or Ron Paul. That is both sides of the spectrum for a definite reason, but still under a neoliberal paradigm of sorts. Which makes that virtue signaling even more empty.
It only becomes law because it is sought as a cash cow or a benefactor to someone like Bernie Sanders. The problem is that someone like him in government is in the majority. Someone like Ron Paul is in the minority when it comes to governance.
Yet back to the justification question, it always rounds itself off at that corner. So in a Christian sense, this is why we repent, this is why we believe in God. It is very essential to our being that we repent. For a secular state, that notion just sounds ridiculous. There is no justification in God's eyes to worship the state, as that would break his first commandment. This is where it will descend into what that virtue signaling does, moral justification for laws passed that are not necessarily moral. The sixth rebuttal is one of my favorites. It will always be a classic. Politics is downstream from culture, then what is downstream from culture? People of a nation, and what is a nation? Well, is it a common heritage, language, and customs, or is it just blind morality of consumption? On the other hand, could it be both? Now those pertinent questions disregard a lot, because as human beings, we feel like that neoliberalism would forego the standards of the kings of yesteryear, yet we often forget how many of those kings were just men.
Yet they were treated with divine providence of them being more than that.
The issue here is that kings and royal families were extensions of that commonality of the land they ruled over. With today's politicians, that is a very rare circumstance.
So if the culture is built on something noble, the culture will reflect nobility onto the world. If it is a culture based on degradation, then the leaders will reflect accordingly.
The constant tightrope walk of apolitical solution is one that is both anecdotally charged and morality-driven, but the results are a mixed bag, especially under a neoliberal offshoot like the United States. The need for commonality and a shared morality is one that is noble, but not always sought after. Deep down, as human beings, we all want to reflect our best intentions, but just like the psalmist said, the wicked will inherit the earth. This is where those best intentions will lead on the road to hell. So with those reflections, the constant need for morality and the push for it should be sought, but having the apolitical solution is something to wrap someone's mind around.